Two, one. Yeah, welcome to this podcast. We are joined today by Professor David Laidler. Professor Laidler has been a leader in the monetarist tradition of analysis of the crucial role of money in determining inflation and short-term economic fluctuations ever since as a doctoral student at the University of Chicago. Professor Laidler was a research assistant for Milton Friedman and Anna Short's Monetary History of the United States, 1867 till 1960, which was published in the year 1963. Professor Laidler has been an eloquent advocate and defender of monetarism, both upholding monetary explanation of inflation and the absence of long-run real stimulus from monetary expansion against Keynesians, old, new, and post, and insisting on the importance of money for short-term fluctuation against new classical claims that any systemic monetary policy will be neutral. Professor Laidler taught at the London School of Economics from 1961 to 1962. Professor Laidler then moved to the University of California, Berkeley, where he was an assistant professor from 1963 till 1966. Professor Laidler then moved to the University of Essex to be a lecturer for 3 years before moving to University of Manchester to occupy the position of professor. Professor Laidler joined the University of Western Ontario in 1975 and is the Bank of Montreal professor there from, or he was actually Bank of Montreal professor there from 2000 to 2005. His influence was extended in part through his 13 textbooks. Some of his most influential books are The Demand for Money, Theories and Evidence, Introduction to Macroeconomics. Both of these have gone through 4 English language editions and were published in numerous other languages. Essays on Money and Inflation, published in 1993. Monetarist Perspectives, which was published by Oxford Philip Allen Publishers Limited, Cambridge, Harvard University Press, 1982. And a Japanese translation came out in the year 1987. His next book is Taking Money Seriously, which was published by Hemel Hempstead, Phillips Allen Publishers Limited, Cambridge, MIT Press in the year 1990. His next book is titled The Golden Age of the Quantity Theory, The Development of New Classical Monetary Economics, 1870 till 1914. It was published by Hemel Hempstead, Phillips Allen Publishers Limited, Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1991, and a Japanese translation came out in 2000. His next book is titled How Shall We Govern the Governor? A critique of the governance of the Bank of Canada. Toronto, C.D. Howe Institute, 1991. His next book is Two Nations, One Money, Canada's Monetary System Following a Quebec Secession. Toronto, C.D. Howe Institute, 1991. And this was published with W.B.B.P. Robson et al. His next book is titled The Great Canadian Disinflation, The Economics and Politics of Monetary Policy in Canada, 1988 to 1993. Toronto, C.D. Howe Institute with W.B.P. Robson. His next book is Money and Macroeconomics, The Selected Essays of David Laidler. It was published by Cheltenham, UK, Lyme, USA, Edward Elgar, 1997. His next book is Fabricating the Keynesian Revolution, Studies of the Interwar Literature on Money, the Cycle, and Unemployment. It was published by Cambridge, UK, and New York, Cambridge University Press, 1999. His next book is 2% Target, Canadian Monetary Policy since 1991, Toronto C.D. Howe Institute with W.B.P. Robson. And his next book is Macroeconomics in Retrospect, The Selected Essays of David Laidler, was published by Cheltenham, UK, Lyme, USA, Edward Elgar, 2004. Professor Laidler has been a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada since 1982 and was president of the Canadian Economics Association in 1987, 1988. Two volumes on David Laidler's contribution to economics have been edited by Robert Leeson, Palgrave Macmillan, 2010. I am going to be pasting the cover page of this book in this video. Professor Laidler has championed the need for macroeconomic theorists and policy analysts to have a historical perspective on how their field has evolved. The subject of discussion of this podcast is titled, Why Money Ought to be Taken Seriously. Yeah, welcome to this podcast, Professor David Laidler. Yes, welcome to this podcast, sir.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, sir. It's an honor to have you on the show. And so my first question to you is about your personal, journey. If you can, tell us about where were you raised and, some words about your upbringing. You were the first of your family to attend secondary school and grew up in Newcastle upon Tyne, England, where your father had a fish and chips shop. So, Professor, tell us about your childhood days and then subsequently, moving to the US to pursue your graduate studies in economics. And
Well,
yes, sir.
I will be brief about this. I was born in 1938, so I was 7 years old when the war ended, and then there was post-war austerity in Britain. So my childhood, we weren't poor, but it was a fairly austere upbringing at that time. I was very fortunate. My father was at home. He was a little older, and he had been severely gassed in Arras during the First World War, so he was exempt from military service in the Second World War. So the shop was open, not every day because fish was scarce. But as a wartime and post-war child, I think I had a pretty good upbringing. We weren't poor by any means. My parents, as you suggested, had pre-First World War educations, and they were very ambitious for me to get a better education. They sent me to an independent school and made sure I stayed there until I got into university. I chose to go to the London School of Economics because I was interested in the world around me.
Yeah.
And I'd heard that the LSE was the best place to study these things.
Yeah.
And I went off to London in 1956 to begin my studies. You've asked me why, in writing, why I chose Chicago eventually for the PhD.
Yes.
What was very important to me at the LSE was that I took a course in the philosophy of science from Sir Karl Popper. And of course, Popper was the great empiricist. Many of the younger staff at the LSE at that time were under his influence and believed that economics should always be done under the discipline of empirical evidence. And I noticed fairly quickly that the University of Chicago in general, but Milton Friedman in particular, was also pretty interested in what was called positive economics. And I thought, well, that's the place for me if I can get into it. And I was lucky in 1960 I did. And then you have told the rest of the story of my academic career.
Yes. So, sir, the Chicago school is considered to be a new classical school, right? And so how would you make the case that it actually complements the ideas of free market capitalist economy? Now, there are some economists, there are many economists who have been, firm critic of the new classical school of thought. For example, economists, such as Paul Davidson, Vicky Chick, they have been a firm critic of, this school. So yes, sir. So
well, I think the reputation of Chicago is a little unfair to the department I was in. I learned my monetary economics at Chicago from Harry Johnson, who
Yeah.
at that time was really an orthodox Keynesian. He was in the middle of a journey from being a Cambridge-style Keynesian, and I think by the time he died in the mid-1970s, he was pretty much a fully fledged monetarist, not so far away from the ideas of Milton Friedman. But Chicago was a very open-minded place, and there was lots of debate. And I wasn't there all the time. I mean, you mentioned Victoria Chick.
Yeah.
Victoria Chick was my friend from 1961 onwards. I spent quite a lot of time in that year at the LSE debating with Vicky when she was a graduate student. And
Okay.
later, when I was in Manchester, I saw quite a lot of her. So I was well aware of the post-Keynesian views as well.
Yeah.
Not Paul Davidson, but Hyman Minsky was my colleague at the University of California, for example.
Yeah.
So I like to think of myself as a rather eclectic economist. I don't like to think of myself as belonging to any strict school. Now, having said that, you made the link to politics, as of course Milton Friedman did.
Yeah.
And I think the point is that the argument that the private ownership of property and secure property rights
Yeah.
enables the individual to follow their own line of thought and debate with less coercion from the state than a system which involves the state having a lot of control over the day-to-day economic lives of individuals. So there is a link between private property and individual independence. And of course, if you are going to base an economy on private property, then you need a market system to coordinate the activities of the individual in the economy. So if that's what you mean by a neoclassical view of the world, I'm very happy to agree to it. That is my view of the world. But I hope I don't hold it as an extreme view. I am a strong supporter of the welfare state. If the welfare state is well organized to provide public education, public health care, income security, and such things, because, you know, there's a lot of luck in life. And I think it's terribly sad that when we only have one life each, some people who suffer misfortune through no fault of their own should have to suffer through their lives. So I think there is a role for the state or in society, a big role, in evening out chances in life, evening out the opportunities that are available to people. Now, again, if you want to call that neoclassical, that's fine. But
Okay. Yes, sir. So yeah, so sir, I come now to, like a more objective sort of, question, which is, linked to the paper that you had actually sent me, and it is titled Macro's Missing Link, the Unbridged Gap Between Monetarism and the Wicksell Connection. So the objective of business cycle analysis is to analyze the problems that cause those problems as the primary driver, and that then lead to lack of coordination of economic activities of individual economic agents. So you make the case, sir, in that paper that both Wicksell connection and monetarism acknowledge the role of role played by monetary exchange and financial institutions, but they approach the issue of what causes cycles very differently, and you make the case that both these line of thought were pushed away due to, and I'm quoting this from your paper, a mixture of semantics, expositional tactics, a particular substantive assumption of dubious generality made by Wicksell, and a crucial place in his exposition, and an error of omission on his part. So, sir, I would like you to give a general background to this and explain as to what really constitutes the Wicksell connection and the family tree of the 20th century macroeconomics ideas due to Axel Leijonhufvud. Yes, Professor.
Yes, well, this phrase, the Wicksell connection, was coined by Axel Leijonhufvud, the great Swedish economist who taught in California for many, many years, who unfortunately died last year. He was a dear friend. And he did that as a joke when he coined the phrase the Wicksell connection. A very famous gangster movie about drug dealing was called The French Connection. And Axel, who had a sense of humor, came up with this, that Wicksell was at the center of everything.
Okay.
This was nevertheless very apt. Now, to put Wicksell in his place, he was a Swedish economist. Wrote his great book, Interest and Prices. He wrote it in German in 1898. Now, Sweden was not exactly an intellectual center in the 1890s, but it did have close connections to both Russian and German scientific thought. So it wasn't a total backwater. Now, what Wicksell was trying to do was take the quantity theory of money, an old theory that goes back to the 16th century, that says the behavior of the price level is determined by variations in the quantity of money, a theory that had begun at a time when those variations in the quantity of money were being caused by inflows of silver and gold from the Spanish Empire in South America, and adapt that kind of theorizing, which of course had not stood still since the 16th century, to modern economies in which most money was being provided not by the mint in the form of coin, but by banks in the form of banknotes, but also increasingly bank deposits. So Wicksell was trying to adapt an old theory of the behavior of the price level to new monetary circumstances. That was his goal. Now, I will come back to how this happened in a moment. What he succeeded in doing was changing the focus of what we now call macroeconomics.
Okay.
Before Wicksell, if you wanted to summarize what is macroeconomics about, it's about the influence of money on the price level. What Wicksell did was bring banks into the picture and begin to discuss the role of the interest rate at which they made their loans on the system. And after Wicksell, the focus of macroeconomics began to shift to the influence of the rate of interest on savings and investment, and the stability of prices and real economic activity as well over time. So between the 1890s and the 1930s, there was a whole array of work that we can't go into now that tried to build upon Wicksell's initial insights and explain the business cycles that could be observed going on in modern Europe and North America of the time. And the big problem that began to appear in this literature is no one could explain why employment fluctuated. And again, this is too complicated a story for now, but John Maynard Keynes' great general theory of employment, interest, and money actually provided a coherent theory of the determination of employment. And just notice, Keynes's book is about employment, and interest and money, and Wicksell's book had been about interest and prices. So you can see the Wicksell connection there, the link there. It's the role that the rate of interest plays in the functioning monetary economy. And the central role that it plays, of course, in linking savings and investment is in determining the way in which the allocation of resources over time, the building up of capital to provide consumption goods in the future out of today's savings, does or does not get coordinated. So that's what the Wicksell connection was about.
Actually, I will, come to that in, great detail, I think, in the following questions. The Wicksell connection and how it is linked with Woodford's, book. So we will get to it. But sir, I just wanted to ask you, will it be right to say that the quantity theory of money was actually in its, heydays during the latter half of 18th century?
The 19th century.
The 19th century, And
yes,
then Wicksell
that,
sort of, something, that he like contributed, which actually led to the demise of quantity theory. Yes, sir. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Well, as first of all to the late 19th century.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I called my book on that period the golden age of the quantity theory.
Yeah.
And there was a little joke in there because it was also the age of the gold standard.
Yeah.
But what had happened within economic theory in the 19th century
Yeah.
and came to culminated in the 1870s was the replacement of the old cost of production or labor theory of value, which said that the value of everything is determined by the inputs that go into its production,
Yeah.
including the value of gold money.
Yeah.
That idea was superseded in microeconomics by the idea that value was a subjective thing, that the individual attaches utility to various goods and expresses that judgment about utility in demanding various goods, and that the value of goods is determined by the interaction of demand determined by utility and supply, which is determined, by the disutility of work, the disutility of saving, and everything. Well, this development in economic theory undermined the idea that there was something natural about using gold and silver as the basis of the monetary system. It just was one way of arranging it. And the quantity theory of money really came in. It had always been there, but it had always been living uneasily with metallic theories of the value of money, as the idea of gold or silver as the natural source of monetary value disappeared. The quantity theory was left by itself as the only coherent theory of the price level. 20 or 30 years. And indeed, that was what Wicksell said at the beginning of his book. He said, the only coherent theory of the price level that currently exists is the quantity theory of money. And I want to adapt this theory to a modern banking system. And as a consequence of that, we had what we called the Wicksell connection. So the quantity theory of money didn't quite disappear in the 20th century. Not every economist followed Wicksell. In particular, there was the famous American economist Irving Fisher, who is still associated with the quantity theory of money through his book, The Purchasing Power of Money. Through the economists at the University of Cambridge, Alfred Marshall, and then his successor, Pigou.
I think Hayek also was not a
Hayek really belongs to the Wicksell connection. Hayek learned his business cycle theory from Ludwig von Mises. And Ludwig von Mises' issue was, well, Wicksell says that the banking system has to get the rate of interest and set it at an equilibrium level, or we're going to have fluctuations. And Hayek took up this idea from Wicksell and developed it into Austrian business cycle theory.
So is that also called the continental tradition?
The continental decision, better call it the Austrian tradition. It's more narrow than that. It's associated with people from the University of Vienna and elsewhere in Austria. Of course, scattered across the world as the 1930s turned into the 1940s. But this is a branch of the Austrian tradition. This is a branch of the Wicksell connection. And there was a big clash in the 1930s between Hayek and Keynes, because Hayek's theory of the business cycle was telling him that once you'd had a Great Depression, the quickest way to cure it was just to let things take their course and let surplus capital wear out and let the economy reorganize itself. And Keynes's work, which also came from the Wicksell connection, but had a connection to the quantity theory as well. This is too complicated for now. But Keynes had come to the conclusion that when intertemporal coordination had broken down and a depression had come about, he agreed with Hayek that it was a failure of intertemporal coordination which had caused the problem. But Keynes's proposed remedy was for the government to intervene and bolster up the level of demand in the economy through fiscal policy mainly, but also monetary policy. Hayek was, let's leave well alone. Well, politically in the 1930s, there was no market for those Austrian ideas, and Keynesian economics took over what we might call political economy, both among professional economists, but among politicians and policymakers as well.
Okay. Okay. So yes, sir. And there is
And,
also, yeah.
and just to complete that, the old quantity theory of money as a theory of the price level fell into disuse because the main problem that people were concerned with wasn't the determination of the level of prices anymore. It was how to deal with the Great Depression.
Yeah. So employment and income actually became the main target of analysis.
That is exactly correct. That is exactly right.
Yeah. So yes, sir. I come now to my next question, which is again linked with Wicksell. And so Wicksell's idea actually centered on the rate of interest, success or failure in coordinating saving and investment, which you just sort of mentioned. Influence the price level and real output. And so he actually had a cumulative process model of price inflation, which was built upon three premises, right? And
Yes, right.
yes, sir. So and he actually draws a distinction between hybrid system and a pure credit economy. And this distinction is important as it was the basis. I mean, I just mentioned in my last question. So it was the basis incorrectly for much on what Woodford built upon and missed many important distinctions. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct as far as it goes, but one has to, let's go back to Wicksell for a moment.
Yeah.
Wicksell wanted to introduce the banking into a quantity theory framework.
Yeah.
The actual analytic method was first of all to set out the economics of what he called a pure cash economy, which was just the old-fashioned quantity theory.
Yeah.
Then he switched to another abstract model, which he called the pure credit economy.
Yeah.
This was an economy in which the only means of exchange were bank deposits, and banks created those deposits every week when they made loans to people at the beginning of the week to produce goods during the week for sale at the end of the week. And when the goods were sold, the firms get the money back, which they paid out to the inputs during the week and paid off their loans, and then we start again. This was a very, very special model with lots of simplifying assumptions. Then Wicksell spent the rest of his book putting together the analysis of the pure cash economy, while there was still gold, with the pure credit economy, and produced his model of the cumulative process, which was actually, in his eyes, a theory of the behavior of the inflation rate in a gold standard economy. Now, fast forward to 2003, Michael Woodford began his book by saying, well, look, the gold standard has disappeared. The only thing that we now have left of Wicksell's analysis as a counterpart in the real world is the pure credit economy. So we can take Wicksell's pure credit economy model, which Wicksell had meant as an abstraction in a model building exercise, and we can take that as a useful model of the monetary system of the modern world and build a theory of monetary policy on that. Now, Woodford was right that the world had developed towards being a pure credit economy.
Yes.
But he was a little, in my view, and I mean, I'm sure he would tell me I'm wrong. In my view, I think he overlooked a lot of the richness of the detail of Wicksell's analysis of monetary policy, even relative to the behavior of banks when he made that simplification. Okay? Because in Woodford's analysis, what the banks do is set the rate of interest. The rate of interest affects real expenditure. Real expenditure affects the inflation rate. The inflation rate prompts banks to change the rate of interest. And you've got a pure theory of economic fluctuations in which causation goes straight from the rate of interest to aggregate demand and output and prices. And the whole monetary system and financial system that Wicksell was very concerned with is simply left out of the analysis. It just isn't there. Well, that works fine for a market economy where everything is functioning. Because when the monetary system is functioning and the financial system is functioning, and the choices of individuals are all being coordinated within that system, can't see money having any effects. The economy just looks exactly like a barter economy, and money fades into the background. Only an expert in monetary economics has to go looking for it. And even he has got to conclude that what's happening is not important for anything. Okay? It's when the monetary system malfunctions that money becomes of critical importance. But a model that assumes from the beginning, as does Woodford, that the monetary system always functions, can't let you think about those dangerous times. The old analysis of the Wicksell connection and of the quantity theory did let you think about those occasions. It let you think about different versions of them. The Wicksell connection allowed you to think of what goes wrong when savings and investment become disconnected from one another. The quantity theory tradition enabled you to think about what happens if money is being created too rapidly and the economy is suffering from inflation. Now, the old literature never quite bridged the gap between those two. It could have, I argue in the paper that you mentioned, but for a variety of reasons, it never did. Or rather, on the occasions where someone wrote a paper in which the link was made, there's a paper by Gustav Cassel in 1928 that does that. Nobody read the paper because they were worried about something else. Good ideas get lost in the development of economics. Now, to come back to Woodford and our current situation, you'll recall that we had a major financial system crisis in 2007 to 2009. And clearly what happened, broke down there, was the intertemporal allocation of resources working through the financial system. We weren't able to think about that using Woodford's model. Somehow we struggled through it. There were some, notably Governor Bernanke remembered the economics of the 1930s. So we got some policy that helped to cope with the problem. Then the economy began to return to normal. Then we had the pandemic. We had economies collapsing because of the dislocation just in everyday markets that brought about. It wasn't in particular an intertemporal breakdown. It was a breakdown of the functioning of markets in general. Policymakers intervened with subsidies here, there, and everywhere, and they also created lots of money, which they transferred to agents. That smoothed the economy down, but it created an excess supply of money, which created inflation. And again, the Woodford-style analysis didn't enable the policymakers to think clearly about this. And for too long, they thought that the inflation they were seeing was a temporary phenomenon that had to do with supply chains and things like that, and did not, in fact, had to do with the actions that they had been taking. I hope this is clear. I mean, this is a very complicated, long historical story.
Absolutely. So, so sir, this actually link is about to end. I will have to send you another link. I will have to send you another link right now.
Okay, then I will leave this one and come back.
So I will send you another link, and I will ask you the question on Irving Fisher's influence on Wicksell, the key role of non-monetary shock. Okay, sir?
Okay, we can talk about that. Yes, I now have to leave this link, go to my email, and I will come back. Okay. Okay.
Professor Laidler, thank you, sir, for actually talking about some of the intricate concepts with regard to Wicksell connection and how it sort of is linked with the great financial crisis and the recent pandemic-induced recession. So I now come back to another very prominent economist of the 19th century, someone you just highlighted, and his name is Irving Fisher. So he actually identified the effects of fluctuations in gold production on the quantity of money as the principal source of secular price level variation in gold standard countries. And so he sort of explained the positive correlation between the level of prices and that of nominal interest rate in terms of the influence on rising prices on inflation expectations. And because of his analysis, Wicksell was less insistent on the key role of non-monetary shocks. I think this is also known as productivity shock. And so, you make the argument in the paper that much of this has to do with the confusion that the use of the word money and credit meant to different economists. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, it is. But the interaction, or rather the lack of interaction, here is more complicated. Just one minor correction. Fisher did indeed begin his work in the 19th century. He didn't die until about 1946 or 47. He had a long life and was very productive in the 20th century as well.
Yeah.
Yes, but let's go back to the behavior of prices in the 19th century. You must remember that index numbers to measure the behavior of inflation are really a product from the 1860s onwards. William Stanley Jevons did the first study, or one of the first studies, of the influence of the gold discoveries in California and Australia on the behavior of prices. He did that study in the 1860s. Fisher was looking at the behavior of prices from the 1890s onwards, and what was concerning him was the way in which price level in gold standard countries fell at about 2% per annum from the 1870s down until the mid 1890s. And he traced, you're quite correct, he traced this to the failure of the world supply of gold to keep up with the increase in the world's demand for gold that came about because, well, the Prussian Empire switched to the gold standard after the Franco-Prussian War. The United States went back to a gold standard at the end of the 1870s after being a paper standard during the Civil War. And what this did, it helped to break down this is getting too complicated, helped to break down the international bimetallic system, which linked the gold-using countries to the silver-using countries, such as India, and caused fluctuations of all sorts. So anyway,
in fact, in that paper, you do draw the case of India.
Yes, well, the case of India is very important historically, because the case of India was a case in which a country shifted from a silver currency to the gold exchange standard. India was really the first country to go on the gold exchange standard that dominated the monetary system until the First World War. So historically, it's very important. But let's go back to Fisher. So Fisher attributed these fluctuations to fluctuations in the supply and demand for gold, the supply and demand for money. Wicksell looked at them and said, well, no, my theory of the cumulative process says that shocks to the economy can come from variations in the rate of interest that investors are willing to pay to borrow from banks. And what happens is the banks set their rate of interest. Investors get more confident for some reason. The rate of interest they're willing to pay goes up. They start borrowing from banks. You get an expansion of credit and money, and prices go up. But the real reason that they're going up is because of the productivity shock that has caused this borrowing rate to go up. Or there's been a collapse in productivity. And in 1898, Wicksell gave an account of 19th century monetary history, pointing to occasions when changes in the behavior of the inflation rate seem to have followed shocks to productivity, never mind the details. And he said, so the evidence on the role of money here is actually misleading. There are deeper processes having to do with variations in long-run productivity underlying this inflationary pattern. Now, historically, this is important because Keynes picked up this idea and developed it in his treatise on money in 1930.
Yeah.
So it's called the Wicksell-Keynes theory of inflation in some of the literature. But, you know, Wicksell published his book in 1898. Well, in the I think it was 1896, finally, the cyanide process for refining gold was developed. And this made the gold mines in South Africa suddenly very economical. They had not really been economical before then.
Okay.
And the world's supply of gold began to expand much more rapidly after 1898 than it had beforehand. And then the period from about 1898 to 1914 was a period of slow inflation across the gold standard world, about 2% per annum down to 1914. Now, later, Wicksell observed this effect. And when he came to write, I think it was the third edition of his lectures in monetary economics, he actually drew attention to the fact that since he had first put forward his ideas about the role of productivity, there had been this extra evidence generated about the role of gold. And he was now less sure than he was that productivity changes had been at the root of things. He thought that perhaps Fisher's ideas about gold had more to them than he had originally believed. Okay?
Okay.
That's that part of the story. The other part of the story is one really about semantics. When Wicksell used the word money,
Yeah.
he meant banknotes and coins. He didn't mean bank deposits.
Okay.
When Fisher used the word money, he included bank deposits. I mean, he discussed them separately, but he used the word money to cover bank deposits. So when Fisher looked at a banking system that was expanding its lending and creating deposits, he saw money expanding. When Wicksell looked at a banking system doing the same thing,
Yeah.
he saw credit expanding, but he didn't see money expanding. And
Okay.
somehow what should have been just a semantic difference
Yeah.
was picked up by subsequent readers as perhaps signifying something more substantive. So Fisher's version of the quantity theory, adapted to the monetary system,
Yeah.
was more like Wicksell's version of the monetary system, the quantity theory adapted to the banking system, than appeared to be the case from just reading what they wrote. But the profession did not really pick up on this similarity. So the Wicksell connection went off in one direction, and the quantity theory tradition didn't really catch up to it. And then, as I say, the quantity theory tradition temporarily disappeared because employment and output fluctuations became the big worry, not fluctuations at the price level.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that, chain of, analysis, as in the next economics, which sort of made some contribution was Gustav Cassel.
Well, Gustav Cassel did make a contribution. I mean, Gustav Cassel was maybe second only to Fisher among the exponents of the quantity theory of money in the 1920s. And he was very famous as an international expert on the gold standard. He was the man that pretty much invented the purchasing power parity theory of exchange rates. He was a very influential economist. In 1928, he wrote an article which was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, in which, without actually naming Wicksell, he linked Wicksell's analysis of the quantity theory of the cumulative process to the quantity theory of money. And he made that link between the quantity theory and the Wicksell connection. But the point is, nobody really read the article, and it was forgotten. The article was rediscovered by Thomas Humphrey, who was a great American historian of
Yeah.
economic thought,
Yeah.
who wrote an article drawing attention to it. So I'm afraid Cassell's article really was not influential at all in the history of economic thought. It's a great pity that it wasn't, because it should have been, but it wasn't. It was there. Cassel understood what was going on, but nobody was listening to Cassel in 1928.
So why do you think this article was, not picked up by economists?
Well, it was in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. It was written in support of a bill that Irving Fisher was helping to promote in Congress to give the Federal Reserve System a legal mandate to pursue price level stability.
Okay.
So the article was, and the bill failed and disappeared. So the article was written in support of a piece of legislation that failed.
Yeah.
And notice its date. It was an article written about money and inflation in 1928. And in 1929, the Great Depression started. So it was overtaken by events.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. And by 1929, Cassel was an old man as well.
Okay.
And he was not very popular among the young Swedish economists. There was a group of very, very talented young Swedish economists at that time: Olin, Gunnar Myrdal, Erik Lindahl. Two of those are Nobel laureates.
Yeah. Yeah.
Working very much in the Wicksell connection on
Yeah.
economic fluctuations, and they undervalued Cassel. Cassel was the old orthodoxy, and they didn't want to promote his work. So that's the other reason. Okay.
So, yeah, but the Economist that was very popular in the aftermath of the Great Depression was Keynes.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So he, as you mentioned, Professor, yeah, he actually wrote a book, a treatise on money. It was published in the year 1930. And so he, in that book, dealt with the supply of money very differently from his much, renowned general theory. Is that correct, sir?
That is definitely correct, yes. And the treatise on money, when Keynes was writing it, he thought was going to be his great work.
Yeah.
And what he was trying to do in that book, very self-consciously, was bring the quantity theory of money, not Irving Fisher's version, but the version that he'd learned from Alfred Marshall and people at Cambridge, into contact with Wicksell's analysis of the cumulative process, of which he was well aware. People forget that in I think it was 1928, Keynes was responsible for getting Richard Kahn, who invented the multiplier analysis.
Mm-hmm.
He got Richard Kahn to begin translating Wicksell.
Okay.
So Wicksell's artwork appeared in English because of Keynes. Okay, Keynes was familiar with it. The trouble with the treatise on money was that the analysis was flawed and it didn't produce fluctuations in real output. It succeeded in producing fluctuations in the price level, but not in output. Of course, the verbal argument was full of discussion of employment and output fluctuations, but the verbal argument didn't fit with the analysis. Okay, so Keynes had to repair that fault. And he did so in the general theory in 1936.
Okay.
And he tells you in the general theory that really you should, in the introduction, that he doesn't have much to say about the monetary system in this book, because he said a lot about that in 1930 in the treatise on money, which leads you to believe he still believed that his stories about how the monetary system actually functioned in the treatise on money was what he still believed in 1936. But in 1936, he was trying to make a specific point. He was trying to make the point that cutting money wages, either through market mechanisms or through a policy of forcing wage cuts on the economy, would not, as many economists were arguing, help to deal with the problem of employment. Okay?
Okay.
That was the major point that Keynes was trying to make in the general theory.
So this is what is called as the problem of information and coordination.
Well, it's the problem of intertemporal coordination. What Keynes was saying in the general theory is that the Great Depression has been caused by a failure of savings and investment to equilibrate with each other at full employment. And if you want to solve that problem, you have to address savings and investment directly. You can't address the problem by trying to work through price flexibility and wage flexibility as it operates in the labor market. Now, let me come to the next point.
Yeah.
He wanted to explain this then very difficult and new idea in the simplest possible way. And the simplest possible monetary system to enable to explain that was a monetary system in which the quantity of money was completely fixed by the central bank, and there was no Wicksellian cumulative process going on. So he adopted the assumption of exogenous money in the general theory, I believe, as an expositional device. I don't think he meant his readers to treat it as a new idea about how the monetary system actually worked. He left it to his readers to adapt what he had to say in the general theory about the way in which savings and investment interacted with what he'd had to say in the treatise on money about how the monetary system worked, but he left that to his readers. And most of the readers didn't make the connection. They adopted his simple exogenous money assumption. And this caused so much confusion in the literature for the next 20 or 30 years. We could sit here for 6 months and discuss the confusion that this caused.
But there are, two main.
But let me just complete Axel Leijonhufvud's point on this.
Yeah.
Axel Leijonhufvud, to the end of his days, lamented that Keynes had buried the Wicksell connection by making that exogenous money assumption in the general theory. He had he'd caused the profession to lose track of Wicksell's great contribution.
Okay. So
this is something else that keeps the monetarist theories apart from the Wicksell connection theories. It shouldn't be, but it happened.
Yeah. So his, general theory was adapted in the form of ISLM model. And you actually, make the case that there are many shortcomings, and even the shortcomings of the ISLM model was exploited even by Friedman in the 1950s, right, sir?
Yes.
So, why don't you tell us? Yeah. Yes.
Yes, well, I am very ambivalent about the ISLM model. One of my books that you mentioned is The Demand for Money.
Yeah.
That book is built around the ISLM model. So obviously, I, in my time, have found it a very useful device. And you mentioned Victoria Chick. Victoria Chick was very critical of me for my acceptance of the ISLM model in that book. And so was Hyman Minsky. Okay?
Yeah.
But for a limited array of uses, the ISLM model was very useful. And as you say, coming forward, in fact, Milton Friedman was informally using that framework in constructing many of his arguments, because the ISLM model is adaptable to the quantity theory of money if you make the effects of the interest rate on the quantity of money demanded very small, then it almost reduces to a very simple version of the quantity theory of money. Okay?
Okay.
Having said that, there was things in the general theory about the role of expectations of the future influencing current behavior, about psychological factors affecting investment, about fluctuations in financial markets caused by people's liquidity preference changing because they were nervous or not nervous about the future. All of those things that were in the general theory were simply tucked into the background of the ISLM model. They didn't fit in the ISLM model. They were outside of it, and they didn't get into the textbooks, including my Demand for Money textbook.
Okay.
the undergraduates were all reading. So I don't want to say that the ISLM model was rubbish.
Yeah,
It was. It was very helpful for dealing with a subset of important problems, but it set a huge subset of equally important problems to one side, and the profession began to lose track of them. Is that a sufficient apology for my role in this?
yeah. And one more, one more thing related with the general theory is that it relied very heavily on the liquidity preference, model of money demand.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Any thoughts there?
Well, the general theory is the first place in the economics literature. Well, let me be careful. The theory of liquidity preference as presented in the general theory is presented in the treatise on money as well. It is in the treatise on money in a different disguise. That said, the critical feature of the demand for money function, the liquidity preference function, as it's deployed in the general theory, is that there is a systematic relationship between the quantity of money demanded and the rate of interest. Now, this is the first time in the history of monetary economics that that relationship was presented as a systematic functional relationship, as a demand curve. You can go back into the 19th century, you can go to Irving Fisher, you can go to almost everybody, and you'll find a paragraph in their writing that says, if the rate of interest goes up, well, the velocity of circulation might go up because people might economize on the use of money. Or if inflation is expected, then people will move out of money because they don't want to see their money balances depreciating.
Yeah,
The rough idea
yeah,
that there was a relationship between the demand for money and the rate of interest is a very old one. But getting that idea precisely formulated
yeah,
was a big contribution in the general theory. And of course, it was then enshrined in the LM curve
yeah,
and reduced to something that was manageable. And the results that it actually generated that were important was you could now show how fiscal policy could affect the level of aggregate demand in a depressed economy. The
yeah,
old argument before the general theory was, well, look, if the fiscal authority starts spending, that is simply going to take bid resources away from private investment.
okay,
And autonomous expenditure in the economy as a whole is going to be the same.
yeah,
Once you have the demand for money a function of the rate of interest, there's another step in that argument. The fiscal expansion causes the rate of interest to go up. People now want to hold less money, and that creates room for the fiscal policy to have its own effects on the level of output, and it doesn't have to crowd out private sector investment. So that was a very important qualification of a policy idea.
yeah. And so, sir, yeah, yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, so in that paper, so this is, I guess, the problem of intertemporal coordination. And you sort of in that paper, you draw attention to the role of economists at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, who actually made some contribution. Just to name some of them, Karl Brunner, Alan Meltzer, Armen Alchian, and Axel Leijonhufvud. All of them were teaching at UCLA.
Yes,
Yeah, yes.
and you should put Robert Clower.
Okay.
He belongs in that group as well because he did teach at UCLA for a while. Yes, this was let me take Brunner and Meltzer first. The best way to look at Brunner and Meltzer in a simplified framework is to say that they were monetarists like Milton Friedman. They were a little later than Milton Friedman in getting their work out, but there was a big overlap between what Brunner and Meltzer did and what Friedman did. But they did bring something extra to monetarism. They were concerned with the theory of why money exists, how it is created, and why a monetary economy is different from a barter economy.
Okay.
Friedman wasn't very concerned with those issues. He knew that people were discussing those issues. He was a very intelligent man, but he wasn't personally concerned with it. There's one place where he said, in an exchange with Robert Clower, that he was no more interested in this kind of fundamental questions about money than he was in the mechanics of making pins. You know,
Okay.
a reference to Adam Smith's pin factory. For Friedman, it was enough that money exists. It's a temporary abode of purchasing power. There's a demand function for it. There's a supply function, and they interact. Brunner and Meltzer wanted to go behind that a little bit. Now, this does link them to the other group at UCLA. Clower, Leijonhufvud, Alchian were concerned with self-consciously concerned with the difference between the barter economy that we teach in microeconomics, monetary economy, which we teach in macroeconomics. And what they noted, what they really brought to our attention, they weren't the only ones, but they were very important contributors to the idea, is that, remember what I said earlier, when the monetary system is working, you can't really see it. Everything works just like the barter economy that you analyze in microeconomics. Okay. So in a way, the institutions of the barter economy that you meet in the micro course, the Valrasian auctioneer, the auction, the tautonomy, the recontracting, and all of those things, those ideas are metaphors for what in the real world is the workings of the financial system. They made that link. And then they made the further link that the problems that you see in the real world of fluctuations in employment and output and inflation, these are what you get when those coordination mechanisms break down. Okay? So that again is the Wicksell connection plus. The way they put it
is this also known as price theory?
Sorry?
So is this also known as price theory?
Whose price theory? Sorry,
I mean, this sort of analysis, this analysis of the barter connection, where property rights and all those things come into the picture.
Well, it does go back. Yes, it does go back to it, but I think we should set that to one side and just think about how these things work in macroeconomics and not pursue those connections, which are important. Okay. But not on this occasion. What we have to worry about is the role of general equilibrium analysis in the development of economic thought. And one of the things that makes this thing so complicated is that Léon Walras wrote in French and taught in Switzerland. And his work was not available in English until sometime in the 1960s. So his influence on the development of economic theory was very indirect. He influenced the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto. John Hicks, who wrote Value and Capital, read Pareto because he could read Italian. He didn't read Walras. So John Hicks was one of the people who brought general equilibrium analysis into the English language, indirectly through Pareto. And of course, general equilibrium analysis also turns up in Paul Samuelson's PhD thesis, the foundations of economic analysis. It was late in arriving in English language economics. In particular, that it didn't arrive properly in English language economics until after Keynes had written the general theory. Keynes had heard of Walras, but he didn't know anything about general equilibrium theory. What we get ex post is when the general equilibrium theorists such as Samuelson start getting involved in economics. It becomes apparent that the general equilibrium model is a model of the economy as a whole. The ISLM model is a model of the economy as a whole, and they're not quite compatible with each other. The way Robert Clower used to put it was, in a Walrasian model, there was a system of equations And all the equations have got quantities on the left-hand side and
Yeah.
prices on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
In an ISLM model,
Yeah.
you've got fewer equations, but some of those equations have got quantities on the right-hand side as well as on the left-hand side. And the prices are given. Now, what is the connection between these two visions of the economy?
Yeah.
This is the problem of the search for the micro foundations
Yes.
of macroeconomics, which begins in the 1960s with people like Klauer and Leijonhufvud. And in order to clarify this, what Klauer and Leijonhufvud did was double back to the general theory and say, this looks like a description of a general system that is different from Walras. It's a non-Walrasian conception of how the monetary economy works. So they double back to Keynes to get insights. And then Axel wrote this great book on Keynesian economics and the economics of Keynes. And just to confuse all of us, including me when I first read it,
Yeah.
and more, he presented the book as if it was a reinterpretation of what was in the general theory, a correct interpretation. Well, yes, but there was an awful lot of original Axel Leijonhufvud thought in there as well. And it wasn't quite clear how much in that book of what Axel called Keynesian, the economics of Keynes. Some of that was the economics of Leijonhufvud. Leijonhufvud gave Keynes credit for anticipating more of Leijonhufvud's ideas than he really did. So again, this confused the readers, and it confuses the literature. But anyway, coming back, this is all happening at UCLA, right?
Yeah.
In the 1960s. And there's a connection to Northwestern University as well, because Klauer had been at Northwestern, and Axel Leijonhufvud was actually formally a graduate student at Northwestern. He wasn't a graduate student at UCLA. He was an assistant professor at UCLA.
Yeah.
But that's why I draw attention to those people. And it's not just me that draws attention to them, obviously. They're very important figures in the development of macroeconomics.
Yes.
They're the ones who developed the alternative way of looking at the micro foundations of economics to the one followed by Robert Lucas and Thomas Sargent, and that from the 1970s onwards.
Okay.
That's the approach to the micro foundations of macroeconomics that makes you pay attention to the role of money in the economy and the role of the financial system in the economy. Those two things that Woodford's analysis just skips over.
Okay.
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 Oh, no, I know this is horribly complicated, but
Yeah.
it's
No,
the
but
way it
just
is.
sticking with
History is not tidy. History is very untidy, and it doesn't move in a straight line in the development of ideas. It goes around in circles and doubles back.
Actually, there is a great line on history. I did a podcast with Professor Kurz. He says that history is not it was, history is it is. So it's happening right now. It's not something that can happen.
That's exactly right. This is why the history of economic thought has to be done over and over and over again, because the history of economics looks different to every generation of economists, because they have to see it through the eyes of the economics that they are doing.
Yeah.
And they are very wise. Would be very wise to look at it and see how similar ideas have worked in the past, see if there are any old ideas that have been overlooked and lost in the past that can help them.
Yeah.
And also to learn the way in which economic ideas affect the way policymakers behave and affect the way the economy behaves and affect the way economic experience unfolds, economic history unfolds.
Yeah. So just sticking with the point on the Walrasian general equilibrium. Now,
Yes.
So Professor, in your view, what is the shortcomings of the Walrasian general equilibrium, since the conventional Walrasian monetary models, they actually have a hard time incorporating money because there is no
they can't really incorporate money into the Walrasian model, because in the Walrasian model, they picture all agents coming together in a marketplace, right? And there is an auctioneer in the middle of the marketplace, and he calls out prices for all the goods and services available. And people put in their bids, and the auctioneer adds up all the bids, sees that supply and demand don't match across markets, and adjusts prices and try it again. That's called tautonymal. And he goes on and on until all plans are compatible. Then agents are free to trade. But the prices are, the equilibrium prices are determined before any economic activity starts to happen. Now, that's a metaphor for a monetary economy where the monetary system is working, okay? But of course, there's plenty of scope in the world for people to make mistakes, to trade at prices that aren't market clearing prices. And when they do that, they're committed to something that in fact has rendered other plans incompatible, and they have to adjust those other plans. That is the kind of microeconomic foundations that Clower and Leijonhufvud were talking about. And of course, they're very, very difficult to analyze. But it's in a world like that, if you think about it, that money has a role. Think of think of yourself in the economy. Let's not worry about the origins of money. Let's assume that money is there. And think of yourself as an agent in the economy that uses money.
Yeah.
You're selling things, you're buying things. You're not sure if you're doing it at the right price. You're not sure you're going to be executing all your plans. You need a buffer. So that if you can't sell what you thought you could sell, you can still buy what you were planning. So you hold an inventory of a general abode of purchasing power, an inventory of money. And for any individual over time, that inventory goes up and down as plans don't work out or do work out or are over-fulfilled. And at the level of the economy as a whole, if the economy is functioning, all of these fluctuations in these buffer stocks cancel out. You don't see them in the aggregate data. But now suppose that you have a bunch of governments who suddenly create a lot of money to cope with the COVID pandemic. Everybody's cash balance, everybody's buffer stock is increased by the receipts that they get from the government. And that's more than they want to hold. Well, what do? Well, the first thing they probably do is say, well, maybe this is going to come away. Maybe I'm going to have a shortfall of my receipts next week, so I won't do anything. But after a while, everybody begins to notice that they've got more money on hand to meet their buffer stock needs. So they begin to try to spend it. You've got more money in your bank than you want. Well, I'm going to spend it on something more useful. Maybe a bond, maybe a new consumer durable for the kitchen. Who knows? You spend it. It's gone away from your cash balance. You've restored your equilibrium.
So sir,
But but I haven't finished.
So this link is about to get finished. I have to send you another one.
Oh, okay. Let me get one sentence right in. It goes to somebody else, and they are now in disequilibrium. That is what's important. Okay. Do you want to do another link? It should be just a short one, I think.
I will have to send you another link. Yes.
Okay, then I will leave and we'll do it again. But we will wind it up on the next link. Okay.
Yes, Professor Laidler. So just taking
I don't have your video.
So just sticking with the point on the microeconomic role of money. So which microeconomic role of money should be taken seriously in models of exchange? Such as, for instance, there is this evolution of search theoretic approach. So, sir, in your view, which microeconomic role of money should be taken seriously?
Yes, it should be taken seriously. I'm not too happy with the search theoretic framework itself as a starting point. That just seems to me, I used to be very, very attracted to it, but when you think about it, starting with a world in which a lot of isolated agents are running around trying to find someone to trade with, very artificial. So my friend Peter Howard, who is another of that. my friend Peter Howard convinced me that it makes much more sense to start with an economy in which there are traders who specialize in selling particular goods.
Okay.
So you go to the trader to buy this, that trader to buy something else, and the trader himself knows where to buy his inputs. But the
Yeah.
trader has to hold inventories of money to cushion his sales against buying his inputs, and his customers have to hold inventories of money as well. That's the kind of world that I like to envision. Of course, this is terribly non-rigorous, and I mean, I have to stress that I'm painfully aware that I'm talking words and it's intuitively very appealing,
Yeah.
but I have not been able to write down the equations that would describe this behavior. I believe that the people who are now working on agent-based computer modeling
Yeah.
of decentralized systems with many, many agents,
Yeah.
they are who are doing the kind of work that I am saying I would find appealing. But I'm not an authority on that. That work, I retired in 2004, and this work has been done since I retired, and I have not kept up with it.
Okay. Yeah. So, sir, I come back to the next question, which is, I think, one of the most important questions, and it is got to do with the book by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, which is
Yes,
Monetary History of the United States. And you worked as a research assistant. Is that correct, sir, for this book?
yes, I did for Anna Schwartz. I worked in New York on that book. My main job was I drew a lot of the pencil versions of the charts in that book that then went to the draftsman for the final versions to be prepared. And I added up a lot of the columns of data and checked the columns of data and things like
Okay.
that. But
Okay.
it was a wonderful experience because I learned from that data aren't just facts in the world out there that you just go out and pick up.
Yeah.
Data series have to be constructed, and the amount of intellectual effort that goes into doing that, it's just as important as anything that goes into economic theory building.
Yeah.
So this was a wonderful experience for me.
Yes, sir. So the bottom line of their, book was that at least six major recessions in US coincided with a decrease in the growth rate of money supply before it
Yes,
happens. Yes, sir.
that's about right. But let me go beyond that. What was really important about that book, it's a work, as you know, of narrative history, not econometric model building.
Yeah.
It discusses business cycles episode by episode.
So I'll just put in one more point, then you can, and so
Yes,
Alan Meltzer, who actually wrote a review of this book, he said that the underlying framework of analysis in that book was the quantity theory of nominal income. And
yes,
Friedman short later, endorsed that. Yes, sir. You continue, please. Yes.
yes, no, that's true. And of course, Alan Meltzer deployed the same theory a little more explicitly in his history of the Federal Reserve
Yes.
System. But what's remarkable about the way Friedman and Schwartz argue is that they take these cycles, cycle by cycle by cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And in every cycle, you can find a monetary explanation. You see the behavior of the money supply, and it leads the fluctuations in nominal income, and the fluctuations in nominal income decompose into changes in prices and real variables in different ways from cycle to cycle.
Yeah.
So for every cycle, there is a monetary explanation. And then for every cycle, there's some other explanation, an alternative
Yeah.
that is quite plausible. But what's remarkable is that the alternative explanations change from cycle to cycle to cycle. And the monetary explanation is there all the time, and the alternative explanations shift over time. So the monetary explanation, if you just look at any one cycle,
Yeah.
you're always in a little bit of doubt. Is that really the case? It could have been something else. But when you look at this evidence pile up time and time and time again,
Yeah.
well, then the monetary explanations become convincing. And we've seen the same thing in the last 2 or 3 years. We've had inflation. There is a
Yeah.
monetary explanation. You can see what's happened to the money supply.
Yeah.
But we had a COVID pandemic. and we have a war in the Ukraine and now a war in the Middle East, and perhaps these shocks have caused the inflation. Well, of course, that's not what we said in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we said it was trade unions and monopoly power that were causing. The monetarists have been saying, in each occasion, it's been the behavior of money that's lain at the root of this. And this is an extension into the future of where Friedman and Schwartz finished in 1963.
Okay. So which monetary aggregates, were being used by Friedman and Schwartz?
The monetary aggregate is the weak link in monetarism, because the models of the quantity theory of money, you can always build a model in which money is a very specific asset, which is very different from anything else in your model. And the quantity theory is very clear-cut. When you go to the real world, there are many things that serve as means of exchange at the same time. And not only that, you've got liquid assets, which though you can't write a check on them, you can access very easily and very cheaply. And there's a spectrum of assets. Question, how do you actually define money for empirical work? Well, that's a thing that monetarists have never really settled. And that debate about defining money is really the Achilles heel of monetarism. I wish I could tell you how to cure it, but I can't. The nearest thing to it, I think, that we have at the moment is the hello, I've lost you.
Yes.
Oh, there, okay. The nearest thing to it is probably divisia aggregate.
Absolutely. Yes.
But even then, there are narrow divisia aggregates, there are broader divisia aggregates, and there are very broad divisia aggregates. You never quite get away from that. What the divisia aggregates do for you is they enable you to take account of shifts between the components of broader aggregates without having to.
So I will come to the issue on the divisia aggregates, I think, in my second or third question from now. But I just right now just want to stick on the quantity theory of money, sir.
Yes, okay.
So it has been, subject of criticism by different schools of thought, and who would know better than you, Professor Laidler. So the real bill doctrine in the 19th century, they sort of said that the money supply is endogenous and not exogenous. Could you, please, Professor, say something about this?
Yes, I can. Just give me several sentences. The real bills doctrine, including that phrase real bills, actually occurs in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in his chapter on banking. And there it turns up as advice to the banker. And he basically says, if a bank wants to stay in business and not fail, what it should do is confine its lending to good, high-quality, short-term commercial paper, where debtors will be continuously paying off those loans, and then you can make new loans. And if the individual commercial bank just does this, this will be a safe way of doing business. Now, in the early 19th century, the governors of the Bank of England picked up this advice of Smith, but took it as advice on how the Bank of England should conduct monetary policy for the economy as a whole. And they argued that so long as they were just making loans on good quality commercial paper, they couldn't be causing inflation. They were just satisfying the economy's demand for liquidity. And the counter argument to that was, yes, but you've got to pay attention to the rate of interest at which you're making those loans, or you can run away inflation. So that was the real bills doctrine as it originally occurred. But nevertheless, there was this nub of truth in it. In an economic system in which banks play the major role of providing money, the quantity of money is not just an exogenous variable set by a central bank. It's an endogenous variable determined within the system. And from the early 19th century onwards, you mentioned in your notes to me Thomas Tuck. Yes, he was a big exponent of the idea of endogenous money. And it was no accident, by the way, that Wicksell began working on the role of banks with the quantity theory through reading Thomas Tuck.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes. So let me back up. Yes, money is endogenous in a world where money is a product of the banking system. But to say that money is endogenous is not to say that that endogeneity is completely passive, that the
Okay.
quantity of money just fluctuates to meet the needs of trade at a given price level and doesn't have any causation for any variables within the economy. There
Okay.
is such a thing as recursive interaction of money with the economic system. So there's a shock to the quantity of money, which causes prices and quantities to change. That causes a further change in the money supply, but
Yeah.
that has further endogenous effects. The real bills doctrine is an extreme version of this that says there are no knock-on effects from the money that's created. Money is purely passive, and I simply don't think that's true. And we can see very clearly, I think, from the behavior of the money supply in 2020-21,
Yeah.
the money supply didn't expand because members of the general public wanted more money to hold. The
Yeah.
money supply expanded because central banks provided governments with the balances to write checks for all the subsidies that they were paying out
Yeah.
to the private sector.
Yeah.
Does this help clarify this particular issue?
Yeah. Yes, sir. And so, sir, I just come back to another criticism of, the quantity theory, which is, on which, the Keynesianisms are actually, like they are this thing. They say that the income velocity is very unstable. Is that correct?
Uh,
Yeah.
well, this has been a very standard criticism of the quantity theory for many years. And I think there are two things to say about that. The first thing to say about that is I don't think any quantity theorist, going all the way back to the 18th century, Cantillon and David Hume, ever said that the velocity of circulation was constant.
Hmm.
They always made statements on an other things equal basis when they discussed velocity. The second thing is that Milton Friedman's big claim was that no, velocity is not stable over time. But the fluctuations in velocity are the stable and predictable results of variations in variables that affect the demand for money, such as the rate of interest and the expected rate of inflation. Okay.
Okay.
Now, that, and furthermore, Friedman was very careful to claim that stability for the demand for money was really a long-run phenomenon. If you look at his early empirical work done around the time he was writing the monetary history,
Yeah.
his observations are average holdings of money over a cycle or
Yeah.
over a cycle phase.
Yeah.
So long run averages and stability of the demand for money on average over longish periods of time
Yeah.
was Friedman's monetarist claim.
Yeah.
That claim, I think, still holds. I think that's still true. The trouble was that enthusiastic people like myself
Yeah.
took up this idea of the stability of the demand for money
Yeah.
and tried to apply it to annual data, even quarterly data, even monthly data. And of course, we ran into trouble with that because
Yeah.
these underlying relationships, think of it, holding money is holding an inventory, and inventories fluctuate over time. That's the
Yeah.
essence of it. And you're trying to model their long-run target value. That's
Yeah.
a long-run concept. You're
Yeah.
not going to find that kind of stability in quarterly data or monthly data,
Yeah.
and we didn't. But for a while, we thought we had. And there
Yeah.
was a big reaction among economists. Well, these claims that velocity is a stable function of a few arguments. Look, all of these short-run functions have gone all over the place. This isn't true.
Yeah.
And the critics were right. But the critics were wrong to take the next step and say, we can forget about money because the long stability of velocity had not disappeared.
Yeah. And so one major assumption of, the quantity theory is, that of full employment, right? And on that point also, the Keynesianisms have been a firm critic. Is that correct? And so what
Well,
happened during the 1960s was that the Phillips curve was actually holding out,
yeah.
but then it sort of went haywire when, the inflation started, rising until Volcker, became the,
Well, This is true, but the assumption of full employment obviously was not true from the 1920s onwards. And it's one of Friedman's great contributions to say, well, think about not so much the old-fashioned quantity theory as a theory that says money causes fluctuations in the price level,
Yeah,
but think of what lies behind that, a stable demand for money function. And you can deploy a stable demand for money function in a
yeah,
model of an economy that generates output fluctuations.
yeah,
You have I mean, even your ISLM model, which is too simple for many things, you
yeah.
can have a stable LM curve and still get that model to produce unemployment, or you can think of it informally as these curves shifting and generating fluctuations in employment. So I think that is an old-fashioned criticism, and it's true of what a lot of the historical literature said, but it's not a damning criticism. It's a criticism that says the quantity theory of money is part of the macroeconomic story. It's a component of the system, but it's not the only thing you need to take account of.
Okay. So, sir,
But you
yeah,
do need to take account of it.
yeah. So, so there was this, period of great inflation. I think from 1965 until 1980. And so, sir, in your view, why did the inflation, why was there a rise in inflation from 1966 onwards? I
I
have
think,
looked at a book by Marcus Nunes. So they sort of make the claim that the argument given by market monetarists sort of explains why this took place. So they say that the Fed printed too much money or expanded the money supply more rapidly than the economy was able to absorb. Yes, sir. Was
yes,
that?
I largely agree with this. I would add that the world was on a Bretton Woods system at the time, pegged exchange rates to the United States dollar, and that the money creation originated in the United States in the 1960s,
Yeah,
and it was associated with the financing of the budget deficits that were created by the Kennedy administration's social programs and the Johnson administration's social programs, but above all, the expenditure on the Vietnam War. It was an old-fashioned war inflation. But its inflation spread from the United States to Europe and the rest of the world through the Bretton Woods system, through the international banking system. But I think the market monetarists are correct in general in their diagnosis of that.
and the oil price crash of 1973 sort of pushed the inflation to be like too out of control. Was that the case, sir?
Well, the oil price increase in 1973 came far too late to have caused the inflation. The inflation started in the 1960s.
Okay.
Uh, you have to think of the oil price increase in 1973
Yeah.
as partly an exogenous political event caused by the reaction in the Middle East to the Yom Kippur War.
Yeah.
Question about that. But also, there was a large element of catch up to a US dollar inflation in the price of oil
Yeah.
embedded in that increase. And
Yeah.
it changed the short run behavior of the inflation rate. It introduced a spike into it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the Federal Reserve System accommodated that spike.
Yeah.
So the oil price increase created a monetary reaction that validated the effect of the oil price increase on the general price level. So it was a big event in an ongoing inflation, which was fundamentally a monetary driven inflation.
Okay. So, sir, I come to the next question, which is, has to do with this concept of, liquidity trap. And so this happened during the Great Depression, and this also happened during the Great Financial Crisis because the interest rate, hit the zero lower bound. And so, you sort of, say that this is actually a case of credit deadlock. And this argument was made by Rolf Hawtrey and Lochin Curie in the 1920s. And so, yes, sir, please, give your thought on this.
Well, the liquidity trap is an area of a demand for money function where it goes horizontal at a low positive rate of interest. It's
Yeah,
interesting to note that Keynes himself in the general theory said this might have happened in late 1933 in the United States. But that's the only occasion he thought it might have happened, and he thought it was a fairly short-term phenomenon anyway.
yeah,
Okay. Um, what a credit deadlock is, it's a state of affairs in which business confidence is so low that businesses stop borrowing from the banking system. And if businesses don't borrow from the banking system can't create money.
okay,
So depression leads to no borrowing, leads to sluggish money growth, leads to a sluggish economy, leads to low confidence.
yeah,
Ralph Hawtrey, I think, was the first person to give this phenomenon its name. And his solution to that was open market operations on a large scale, quantitative easing, as we would now call it.
yeah, please,
Let the central bank go out and buy lots of bonds.
yeah,
And Hawtrey thought if you bought enough bonds, this credit dreadlock would eventually break because
yeah,
people would have so much money they would start to spend it.
yeah,
And Humphrey, interestingly, said that if you can't find enough private sector bonds to buy,
yeah,
then let the government create deficits and monetize them and put the extra money into circulation that way.
okay,
So to sum up, the liquidity trap and the credit deadlock are both explanations of why it's difficult to expand an economy with expansionary monetary policy.
yeah,
Says if you get the money into circulation, people just pile it up and don't spend it. There's not much evidence for that. The other is that you can't get money into circulation in the first place because the private sector won't borrow from the banking system to enable this money to be created, and that's
yeah,
the credit deadlock argument. And you can break that with quantitative easing on a sufficient scale,
yes,
perhaps accompanied by fiscal policy.
yeah. So,
Okay,
sir, do
but
you,
but, but one little note: you can have a liquidity trap within the banking system, especially under modern conditions. It's possible for the central bank to create reserves for the banking system, which the banking system simply piles up without being willing to make further loans to the private sector. So
okay,
perhaps to break the liquidity trap, when the central bank actually gets into the business of buying bonds, it has to buy them not from the banking system, but from the non-bank public or the government.
okay,
Okay.
but,
Importantly, this is an important point. In 2008, 2009, there
yeah,
was a big increase in Federal Reserve liabilities.
yeah,
But there wasn't a big increase in the money supply because those reserves piled up in the banking system.
yeah.
Some people have called that a narrow liquidity trap, and that phenomenon certainly seems to have existed.
And so the interest was paid on those. The Federal Reserve has discontinued its
Well,
reserve.
they were paying interest on the reserves, and there was no incentive for the banks to go on and try to get rid of them and replace them with income interest earning private sector assets. That was the essence of what happened then.
Okay. So, sir, I will ask you, so in your opinion, do you think that the quantitative easing, worked in the way that the Fed, would have hoped for, in the sense that the
Sorry,
recession,
ask that question again. I missed something. Do I think the quantity theory?
the quantitative easing, QE, which the Fed
Oh
took,
yes, QE. Yes.
do you think that the Fed would have, like it worked, the Fed, would have hoped for the quantitative easing in ending the recession as, quickly as possible?
Well, I think the quantitative easing that was undertaken in 2008, 2009
Yeah,
was fine because it prevented the banking system from collapsing,
yeah,
and the money supply didn't collapse. So in this time around, with the pandemic, the
mm,
quantitative easing led to a big explosion in the money supply.
mm,
And I find it hard to blame central banks for what happened in 2020-21 because we were in uncharted waters and they had to react very, very quickly to an economy that was grinding to a halt, both the supply side and demand side chaos caused by the pandemic. So what I would blame them for is as 2020 went into 2021 and 2021 progressed, they didn't really take notice of what they'd done to the money supply. They
mhm.
just let it sit out there. And I think that they could have begun to rein in the money growth earlier. They could have been less confident that the inflation they were beginning to see was just a transitory phenomenon. They
Yeah,
were very slow off the mark in reacting to their own, I won't say their own previous mistake, I'll say to the consequences of their own previous policy, which they'd had to improvise. I think that's
yeah,
where the was.
yeah. So, yes, sir. So I come to the next question, which is, I think you were making this point that the Friedman and Schwartz recognized that when they say money, they were referring to a multitude of assets. And so each type of money should not simply be, given equal weight, but rather each asset, should be weighted by its degree of moneyness. Correct, sir?
Yes, they did not do that, of course. They just simply summed uh, currency demand deposits and time deposits. But they, of course, were dealing with a very simple monetary system, banking system, compared to the banking system we have now.
Yeah,
But now, William Barnett in particular, but
yeah,
Michael Borger as well, Michael Bordeaux as well, a number of economists are insisting on producing weighted sums of these assets
yes, yeah, yeah,
using a Divisier index, and
yeah,
we won't go into the details of that now.
yeah,
And it does seem that it is helpful to do that. The aggregates that are produced by weighting assets
yeah,
by their degree of moneyness
yeah,
seem to display more stable characteristics than the unweighted ones. And
yeah,
that's progress in applied economics. And I think that might be helpful for central banks if they ever start taking notice of monetary variables again. I think they would be wise to look at these divisier aggregates.
uh,
But, this is much of this work has been done since I retired, and I've tried to keep up with it, but I'm not on top of all the details of it. But even in the last edition, the final edition of my Demand for Money book, which was in
yeah,
the late
yeah,
1980s, I
yeah,
think I wrote a couple of paragraphs about divisier aggregation and said it looked like a very useful step forward. And certainly I would still think that. And I don't want that to sound condescending. I mean, it is a useful step forward.
yeah. So, so he has his, book Getting It Wrong, How Faulty Monetary Statistics Undermine the Fed, the Financial System and the Economy, where he gives, a lot of empirical evidence on, dating back to the 1960s, there was
Yeah.
this case of missing money. But instead, if you look at it, it's actually is a measurement, measurement of money problem. Because if you measure money via the Divisier way, the case of missing money just is goes away.
Yes. This is true. What happens with divisier aggregates is that when the monetary system is fairly calm, they behave very much like the simple sum aggregates. It doesn't really matter which one you're using.
Yeah,
When the monetary system is turbulent, particularly when there are big shifts in the relative interest rates between various kinds of liquid assets and means of exchange, then the divisier aggregates pick these things up and give you more reliable indicators. And an early version of that was an early example of that was in the United States in 1982-83. You could have caught that issue if you'd paid attention to the effect of the rate of interest, what was happening to the rate of interest on the prospects for the velocity of narrower monetary aggregates. So it wasn't as if you could have got that right without the divisier aggregates, but they
yeah,
got but they got it right much more simply and much more easily by applying divisor aggregation there. So this is an example of why these things are useful.
Yeah. And so he actually makes the case because the complexity of asset substitution is actually evolving, and so is financial innovation with time. And so this is more of a case for why central banks in general should actually be using divisor aggregates also. IMF also recommends this. There is, recommendation on this front also. So,
Yes,
sir,
I think that
yeah,
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. I don't think for the money supply series and the monetary history of the United States it would have made very much difference. But for today's monetary system, yes, it makes a much bigger difference because it's much more complicated and much less regulated as well.
okay. And so what are your thoughts on, market monetarist movement, which is
Well,
spearheaded by
I'm
Scott
very pleased.
Sumner? Yeah.
I'm very pleased they're there. I like the work. I'm not a big fan of targeting nominal income growth. I think that's too complicated. I think just targeting inflation is a nice, simple policy goal, which ordinary people understand. They understand what the cost of living is. So if they're told the central bank is targeting the cost of living, that means something to. I'm not sure that they know what aggregate nominal GDP really means. So I'm not sure that the messaging from the central bank is as clear on the nominal income growth targeting. And I think it does have some perhaps unfortunate possibilities. I don't think you would want to be on a nominal income growth targeting regime in the United States at the moment because nominal income growth has gone so far above target as a result of the inflation. I don't think you want to go back to the old path. I think there's too big of a risk of a recession,
Okay.
and if you do that. So no, inflation targeting is a very crude policy. It says bygones are bygones, and yet when you apply it on a day-by-day basis, it's actually been one of the more successful regimes in monetary history. It was first introduced in New Zealand and Canada in 1991.
So just on that point, because in the paper that you sent me, the footnote number 3, so you draw
Yeah.
attention to paper by Lars Jonung, and where he says that Sweden in the early 1930s.
Oh, yes. The idea of inflation targeting itself was not invented in New Zealand in 1991.
Yeah,
In fact, Wicksell, towards the end of Interest and Prices,
yeah.
imagined a world without the gold standard in which the monetary authorities tried to stabilize the price level by varying the rate of interest. Now, he was thinking of stabilizing the price level, not the inflation rate, but still, that is the basic inflation targeting idea. And it is true that in the early 1930s, in Sweden, they did try the experiment of varying the rate of interest to control the price level. This was after Britain went off the gold standard and Sweden went off the gold standard. But I'm a little bit nervous about putting too much weight on that episode because it only lasted about 18 months. And 18 months is not a long time to judge a policy regime. I mean, the lags in the effects of monetary policy are anything between 9 months and 18 months. So an 18-month episode does not really tell you very much. But it's interesting as a historical curiosity. Sweden was the first country to try this, if only in the short run. And Wicksell did actually propose this kind of policy. And of course, this is the kind of link that Woodford is pointing to when he refers to Wicksell while setting out his own theory of how to run an inflation targeting regime. So, these things do fit together.
Okay, so just sticking with the point on the inflation targeting, so you are a proponent, of this. So, any thoughts, sir, on what should the central banking objective be in the case of emerging market economies, where there are a lot of structural issues which sort of are different from advanced economies? Any thoughts?
You know, I don't know enough about emerging market economies really to want to venture into this debate. I would notice that advanced economies, they also have structural problems.
Okay.
And I'm comfortable in advanced economies to have the central bank just stick at controlling inflation and nothing else. But of course, advanced economies have got all sorts of fiscal and regulatory tools at their disposal to
Yeah.
deal with issues. I simply don't know enough about today's emerging economies to know what should be done. I would certainly urge them to try to keep inflation low and to put low inflation high upon the list of priorities, because if you don't have stable money and you want your economy to function along market principles, well, you need markets to be able to work, and you do need low inflation for that to happen. But beyond that, I wouldn't want to dictate a monetary regime, say to India or Brazil.
Okay.
Leave that to economists like you who know the local situation and wouldn't overlook the things that shouldn't be overlooked, and which I would have.
So this is the same thing as monetarism without money, inflation targeting.
Yes. Well, I think inflation targeting does say that inflation is a monetary phenomenon.
Yeah.
That is a very monetarist doctrine.
Yeah.
It also says that policy should aim for long-run stability rather than try to fine-tune anything. That is a monetarist doctrine. But I think that it says you can do this by manipulating the interest rate. Well, that's all right. Manipulating the rate of interest is one way of running monetary policy. But then it also says you can ignore the behavior of the money supply safely when you're carrying out this policy. There, I think you have a mistake. And I think the evidence of the last 4 or 5 years shows that that's a mistake. So I don't think it is quite monetarism without money, or rather I might say monetarism without money. The without money bit is a flaw in the current policy regime. And I do wish that central banks would at least pay attention to the behavior of the variable, even if only in an informal way. I'm not asking them to put it into their forecasting model tomorrow.
Yeah.
But just keep an eye on what's happening.
Yeah.
And when something strange seems to be happening, to ask why, and then let the discussion go from there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. It was such an honor. Any last point, Professor, that you...
No, I think I would just like to thank you for your interest in my work, and thank you also for the preparation that you obviously put into formulating your questions, and the sequence of this last hour or so has been a real pleasure for me. So I thank you very much for it.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. It's actually is an honor to be able to, host a scholar of, your standing.
Well, I am honored too at my age to have been dug up and interviewed.
No, it is absolutely important. As you said, economic history is not something that was happening like previously. It's happening currently.
That is correct. That is certainly right.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.